The first time I heard the word Montauk spoken like a warning, it wasn't in a podcast. It was in a parking garage that smelled like oil and old concrete, under a single fluorescent tube that kept flickering as if it couldn't decide whether it wanted to exist. The man who said it didn't raise his voice. He didn't make it dramatic. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He just tightened the strap of his worn leather briefcase, stared at the far wall like he was reading something written there, and said, "Philadelphia was the prototype. Montauk was the correction." Then he paused, like he'd accidentally spoken in a language he wasn't supposed to use anymore. And when I asked him what he meant, he finally met my eyes, calm, irritated, almost disappointed. "You asked about time," he said. "You're going to get time. But you're not going to like how it behaves." That was the beginning. Not the beginning of the rumors. The beginning of me realizing the rumors were built like nested boxes. Every time you opened one, there was another inside it. And somewhere at the center, hidden beneath decades of pop culture, paranoia, and government silence, was a thread of something that felt organized. Not proven, not clean, but organized. If you've heard the phrases Philadelphia Experiment or Montauk Project, you probably already know the tone of the internet version. Invisibility, teleportation, a ship disappearing, sailors fused into metal, time travel, mind control, a secret base at the tip of Long Island, a chair that amplifies thought, a monster pulled from someone's imagination. It's a story that refuses to die. And stories that refuse to die usually do it for one of two reasons. Either they contain a truth people can't stop touching, or they contain a fear people can't stop feeding. So I decided to approach it differently. Not as a believer, not as a debunker, as a listener. A person trying to map how these claims traveled, where they mutated, and why so many people, military, civilian, conspiracy theorist, and skeptic, kept circling the same coordinates. Philadelphia, Montauk, and a third word you don't hear as often but should. Control. Because beneath every time travel rumor is the same human desire. To control what cannot be controlled. To reach into the one force that humbles everyone, time, and put it on a leash. The CIA officer, retired, he insisted, retired for real, didn't claim he had seen time travel with his own eyes. He wasn't selling a miracle. He was selling a warning. He said the real story wasn't about bending time like a comic book. It was about how governments behave when they believe time is a battlefield. He introduced himself with a first name that might have been real. I'm not going to use it here. Not because I'm protecting a secret agent, because the point isn't his identity. The point is how he spoke. People who make things up tend to decorate. They love vivid details they can't possibly verify. They build castles. This man did the opposite. He cut. He simplified. He left empty space on purpose. And in those empty spaces, you could feel the weight of something that had been rehearsed. Not for an audience, but for survival. He said, "If you want to understand Philadelphia, stop thinking about magic. Think about war." Then he tapped the side of his briefcase. World War II wasn't just about ships and guns. It was about perception. It was about what you could hide, what you could misdirect, what you could make the enemy believe. That's the first seed. Perception. Because the original Philadelphia Experiment story isn't only a time travel story, it's an invisibility story, a story about making a ship vanish, at least vanish to enemy sensors. And in the 1940s, the idea of hiding a ship wasn't science fiction. It was an obsession, camouflage, deception, electronic warfare in its earliest form, making the enemy's instruments lie. Start there, he said. Not with time, with misdirection. The second seed he planted was even simpler. The government doesn't need to create miracles, he told me. It only needs to be ambiguous. Ambiguity breeds legends. Legends hide budgets. Budgets, that word always sounds boring. But budgets are the bloodstream of secret projects. Budgets are what turn ideas into equipment. Budgets are what keep doors locked. And budgets are what keep people quiet. The third seed was personal. He said, "If you are looking for a single program called Time Travel Project, you'll never find it. You'll find fragments. You'll find parallel efforts. You'll find failures. You'll find the same concepts appearing under different names, in different decades, for different reasons. And you'll find one consistent pattern. Whenever the line between mind and machine gets blurry, someone tries to weaponize it." That's when I understood what he was actually offering. Not a smoking gun, a map of a mindset. And then he said the sentence that locked me into the story. "Philadelphia and Montauk are not twins," he said. "They're a parent and a child. One birthed the legend, the other fed on it." I asked him which one was real. He smiled, not warmly, like someone watching a child step toward a hot stove. "Real is the wrong question," he said. "And if you've ever dealt with intelligence people, you know that's how they talk when they don't want to lie, but don't want to tell you the truth either." So I changed the question. "Why did the legend start?" I asked. He nodded. Finally, a question he liked. He told me about how myths form around classified work. You have a sealed project. You have sailors and engineers and technicians who see pieces of it. They don't see the full plan. They see a strange test, a weird piece of equipment. A ship moved into a restricted zone, a sudden blackout, a rumor about someone getting sick. And then the war ends. People go home, they talk, but they can't talk plainly because they're scared, or because they signed papers, or because they don't want to sound insane. So the story comes out sideways, half truth, half imagination, half fear, and then the public does what the public always does. It completes the picture. "Philadelphia is a masterpiece of completion," he said, "a rumor that grew muscles because it lived in darkness." He didn't deny that strange experiments happened. He didn't confirm a ship teleporting. He did something more unsettling. He described how a military deception project could accidentally generate the kind of witness experiences that later get translated into time travel. In his framing, the earliest version of the Philadelphia story is about equipment designed to interfere with detection, to bend signals, to distort interpretation. And when you bend signals, you also bend perception. You can make things appear displaced. You can create timing errors. You can create the impression of vanishing. You can even create physiological effects, nausea, disorientation, if people are exposed to strong fields or intense noise. Not because time is broken, because the body is. "So," I said, "you're saying it was just electronic warfare?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm saying that's how it begins. That's the door. Once people believe the door exists, they start walking through it with bigger ideas." Bigger ideas. And that's where Montauk enters. Montauk isn't a WWII naval rumor in his telling. Montauk is a Cold War appetite, the kind of appetite that emerges when the world divides into two paranoid giants and both believe the other has invisible weapons. He asked me if I'd ever visited Montauk Point. I hadn't. But I knew the images, the radar tower, the fenced-off areas, the constant wind, the feeling of an outpost at the edge of something. "That's the perfect place for a story," he said. "A point, a boundary, a lighthouse, a place where people already feel like they're standing at the edge of the known world. Now add military infrastructure. Now add secrecy. Now add time." He leaned back against a concrete pillar. Then he did something intelligence people do when they're about to say something dangerous. He reframed it. "Let me tell you what Montauk was to the people inside the building," he said. It wasn't time travel. It was a set of problems. Problem 1. How do you influence perception at a distance? Problem 2. How do you move information without physically moving it? Problem 3. How do you make a human operator more than human? Faster intuition, better prediction, stronger resistance to fear. Prediction. That word landed differently, because prediction is the sane version of time travel. If you can predict the enemy's next move, you don't need a time machine. You just need to be one step ahead. And once you frame it as prediction, he said, you can justify a lot. This is where we have to be careful. Because the CIA officer never told me, yes, there was a Montauk time portal. He didn't claim monsters. He didn't claim a chair that summons objects. He claimed something more believable and more morally complicated. He claimed that throughout the Cold War, multiple agencies explored fringe ideas about the mind, perception, and influence. Not because they were mystical, because they were desperate. Desperation is the engine. In war, you fund what you can't afford to ignore, even if it sounds ridiculous, especially if you fear the other side is doing it too. He brought up remote viewing without naming it directly. He talked about non-traditional intelligence collection. He talked about psychic programs, the way a person talks about a bad investment that still taught the investors something. Not success, but technique. How to run a compartment. How to recruit people with unusual claims. How to structure experiments so that results look like results. How to build a narrative of progress even if the outcome is fog. And here's what people don't understand, he said. The most valuable thing a program can produce isn't a miracle. It's a method, a framework, a vocabulary. Once you build that, it can be repurposed. And that's when legends start feeding on infrastructure. Legends feeding on infrastructure. That line stayed with me, because it suggests that Montauk, whether literal or not, could be the kind of place where multiple classified efforts overlap. Signals, psychological operations, radar, electronic warfare. And perhaps in the rumor mill, those overlaps become a single monster. That's how projects become myths. The myth is the only way the public can hold the complexity. So I pushed him. If Montauk is not time travel, why does the story keep returning to time? Why the specific claim of sending someone to the past or pulling someone from the future? Why that particular fantasy? He didn't answer immediately. He looked past me again, as if he was listening to a memory coming down a hallway. Because time is the ultimate alibi, he finally said. I asked what he meant. He said that if you can convince people a project is impossible, true time travel, true teleportation, true paranormal capability, then even the real projects get protected by absurdity. Absurdity is camouflage, he said. It makes serious people look away, because no one wants to be the person arguing about portals. So the portal's story protects everything else, signals, influence, surveillance, because critics throw the whole thing in the trash. That's the fourth seed. Absurdity as camouflage. And then he gave me the hook that kept me awake at night. He said, but sometimes the absurdity isn't just camouflage. Sometimes it's a symptom. Sometimes people inside these projects encounter effects they don't know how to describe. And when humans encounter something they can't describe, they reach for the biggest language they have. Time. God. Monsters. Because what else do you call a phenomenon that makes your sense of sequence collapse? Sequence. That word matters. Because you don't need a machine to travel to the past to experience time-breaking. You only need a mind under stress, a human nervous system exposed to intense conditions, or a sensor environment that distorts perception, or a protocol that isolates people until they lose their grip. And that is where Philadelphia and Montauk, legend and correction begin to merge. Philadelphia. A rumor about invisibility and displacement. Montauk. A legend about mind and prediction and something that feels like time. But we still haven't reached the darkest part. The part where these stories stop being entertaining. The part where, if even a fraction is true, the ethical price becomes the real horror. Because if there is one recurring claim across Philadelphia and Montauk narratives, it's this: human subjects, people used, people harmed, people broken. I asked the retired CIA officer about that. Not directly. You don't ask a man like that. Did you abduct kids? You ask a quieter question. What was the cost? His jaw tightened. And that was the first time his calm felt like an effort. There's always a cost, he said, and the cost is usually paid by the people who can't complain. Then he added something that made my stomach drop. In the Cold War, we treated the mind like territory. We mapped it. We invaded it. We tried to plant flags. And the line between testing and hurting was easier to cross than people want to admit. He didn't say, Montauk did this. He said we, which is how you know he believed he was speaking truth. Not about one base, about a culture. So here's where the story becomes a ladder. Because the next step isn't a portal. The next step is paper. Names. Claims. The way these stories found their way into books, interviews, and late-night radio. The way they fused into a mythology that became bigger than any single witness. And the CIA officer gave me a warning about that too. He said, if you want the truth, don't start with the loudest claim. Start with the earliest. Track how it changes. Look for what stays consistent. Because consistency is where the real story hides. Even in lies. So that's what I did. I went back to the roots. The earliest public threads. The earliest names. Not to prove time travel. To prove the pattern. And the pattern begins, inevitably, with Philadelphia. A destroyer escort ship. A wartime rumor. A story of invisibility. A story of a ship appearing somewhere it shouldn't. A story of men getting sick. A story told and retold until it became less about a ship and more about the idea that the government can bend reality. Then Montauk. A geographic magnet. A place that feels like a boundary. A Cold War structure that invites imagination. A radar station. A story about mind experiments. A story about a chair. A story about time. What connects them is not the literal mechanics. It's the emotional logic. A government in wartime. A government in paranoia. A government with money. A government that can isolate a project and keep it secret. And a public that senses that secrecy and fills it with monsters. In the next part, we're going to walk through the key storytellers who made these legends sticky. We're going to examine the claims that can be checked, the claims that can't, and why certain details, certain specific images, keep appearing. Not because they're true, because they're engineered to feel true. And then we're going to confront the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that time travel exists, but that the effort to create it, real or symbolic, could still damage people. Because even if you never open a portal, you can still ruin a mind. And that is, in its own way, a form of time travel. You take a person's future, you erase it, and you call it research. The first name you keep running into when you trace Philadelphia back to its roots isn't a sailor, it's an author, a man named Morris K. Jessup. If you've never heard of him, that's almost the point. Jessup wasn't a government official. He wasn't Navy brass. He was a writer, an early UFO-era thinker who published a book in the 1950s about UFOs and what he believed they might imply. He was the kind of man who didn't just want to witness mystery, he wanted to solve it. And then, after his book came out, Jessup received letters. Not fan mail. Not praise. letters full of wild marginalia, and claims that sounded like someone trying to yank the curtain off reality. The writer of those letters used a name that would become a shadow. Carlos Allende, sometimes spelled differently, sometimes hinting at another identity, but always pointing toward the same claim. A naval experiment. A ship. A field. And an effect that sounded like invisibility, then escalated into something like displacement. This is where the legend becomes tricky. Because if you're looking for a single official file labeled Philadelphia Experiment, the trail will disappoint you. But if you're looking for the moment where a rumor crystallized into a narrative, Jessup's letters are a good candidate. They are one of the earliest pieces of paper that carry the experiment's myth into a form that can travel. Not mouth to mouth, ink to ink. According to the story, a government office became interested in those annotated pages, not because they believed in teleportation, because someone, somewhere, recognized a dangerous pattern, a strange claim attached to a real ship, a real port, a real war, a rumor that could mutate into something operationally inconvenient. And here's the part that always makes me sit up straighter. Jessup's book, his UFO book, was reportedly reprinted in a small run with Allende's annotations included. A bizarre artifact, part prank, part obsession, part signal. If the story is true, it means the legend wasn't only born in the public. It was curated, not necessarily to reveal, possibly to contain. When I brought Jessup up to the retired CIA officer, he nodded as if I'd finally found the correct door. "That's how it spreads," he said, "not because a ship vanished, because paper lasts, because paper can be moved without anyone admitting they moved it, because paper can be used to guide attention." Guide attention. There it is again. Perception. Control. Now, the ship. The legend is often attached to the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, a real vessel, a name you can look up. The claim is that the Eldridge was involved in a secret experiment in Philadelphia, sometimes described as a Navy attempt at invisibility using electromagnetic fields, sometimes described as something much stranger. The most sensational versions say the ship disappeared, then reappeared in another location, sometimes Norfolk, sometimes back again, and that crew members suffered horrific consequences. Men fused into metal, men going insane, men blinking in and out of existence. If you've been online for any length of time, you've heard those details. They're always the same, because repetition is how a myth hardens. But what happens when you treat the story like an intelligence analyst instead of a fan? You separate the stable elements from the decorative ones. Stable element 1. The Navy did use degaussing, a real process, a real wartime practice. Ships were degaussed to reduce their magnetic signature and protect against magnetic mines. That's not science fiction, that's engineering. Stable element 2. The war produced a lot of classified experiments in electromagnetic technology, radar, jamming, signal manipulation, the infancy of electronic warfare. A time when make the enemy's instruments lie wasn't a metaphor, it was doctrine. Stable element 3. Sailors can experience strange physiological effects around certain equipment, not supernatural, human, disorientation, headaches, nausea, the body reacting to an environment it didn't evolve for. Now stack those stable elements. You can easily imagine a scenario where a ship undergoes a procedure or test that creates unusual sensations and unusual rumors. You can imagine people mistaking the experience of electromagnetic interference or sensory disorientation for something far larger. You can imagine a blackout that gets retold as a disappearance. You can imagine a brief miscommunication about ship positioning that becomes teleportation over decades. So why does the story insist on time travel? Why does it escalate beyond invisibility? Why isn't the Philadelphia myth just they tried to hide a ship from radar? Because invisibility isn't enough. It doesn't satisfy the hunger. Time travel does. The CIA officer called it the vertical escalation of myth. He said the public rarely holds a story at its most plausible level. It climbs, it inflates, it seeks an emotional peak. And in American culture, the emotional peak of a secret government project isn't better radar. It's they touched God's mechanisms. But there's also another reason, a more cynical one. A reason that has nothing to do with how humans daydream and everything to do with how institutions hide. He told me about myth shields, not official terminology, a behavior, a technique. If a secret project is real and sensitive, he said, the best protection is to be adjacent to something that makes people roll their eyes. Put your truth near a ridiculous claim. Anyone who pulls at the thread becomes a joke. That's how you keep journalists from staying too long. He didn't say, "We did this with Philadelphia." He said it like a man describing weather, a pattern that repeats. So here's the first reveal in our ladder. Philadelphia, at its core, doesn't need to be a literal time travel event to be useful as a myth. It only needs to be believable enough to circulate. It needs a real ship, a real war, a real port, a real technology. And then it needs one thing that can't be verified. That's the spark. Now, the second reveal. The Philadelphia story doesn't become Montauk automatically. It needs a bridge, a storyteller. A translation from wartime rumor into Cold War conspiracy. And that bridge is made of voices. People who, in the 1970s and 1980s, began connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. Not because they were evil, because they were fascinated, because they were afraid, because they were trying to make sense of a country that had just survived Vietnam, Watergate, MKUltra revelations, and a deep cultural wound. The realization that the government could lie to you for years without blinking. In that era, the soil was perfect. Plant a secret. It grows into a forest. Montauk becomes the forest, and the most common path into it runs through two names, Preston Nichols, Peter Moon. Together their books framed The Montauk Project as a sprawling underground experiment involving mind control, time travel, psychic amplification, and a secret base at Montauk Air Force Station, also known as Camp Hero. Now, Camp Hero is real. The radar was real. The Cold War infrastructure was real, and there are tunnels. Many military installations have tunnels. That's not exotic. But the Montauk narrative doesn't stop at real geography. It overlays an invisible architecture, a facility below the facility, a program below the program. This is where the legend becomes sticky, because it uses a trick that works on the human mind. It uses truth anchors. A real place, a real fence, a real radar dish, a real sense of isolation. Then it drapes fiction across it like camouflage netting. When I finally visited Montauk Point, I understood why it's such a magnet. The wind doesn't just blow, it pushes. The ocean doesn't just sit, it stares. And the old military structures, some decaying, some preserved, feel like bones, evidence of something that used to be alive. I stood outside the fence line and watched people walk by as if nothing was unusual. Tourists, joggers, families. Then I turned and looked at the base again. And in that moment, I felt the psychological mechanism that makes myths possible. A place like this begs to be filled. If you don't know the history, you imagine one. If you do know the history, you still imagine what you weren't allowed to see. That's Montauk's first power, not time travel. Atmosphere. The CIA officer's second power was how he framed it. He didn't talk about a chair that summons monsters. He talked about a chair as a symbol. He asked me if I knew what the chair actually resembles in real research environments. He described EEG rigs, sensory isolation, auditory entrainment, transcranial stimulation, tools designed to alter attention, perception, and emotional state. People hear chair and think science fiction, he said. People inside a lab hear chair and think subject station. Subject station, a phrase that makes the mythology suddenly colder. Because if you translate Montauk's wild claims into the language of real programs, you don't get portals. You get experiments on human cognition, training methods, influence research, stress manipulation. And in the Cold War, the moral line was flexible. This isn't speculation pulled from thin air. We know historically that U.S. intelligence explored mind and behavior manipulation. MKUltra is not a rumor, it's documented. And whether you believe its most extreme interpretations or not, the existence of the effort is enough to change how you treat stories like Montauk. Because once you know the government did unethical experiments, the question shifts. Not would they, but where did they stop? That's the third reveal. Montauk's credibility doesn't rest on time travel. It rests on precedent. Precedent is a dangerous thing. It makes impossible stories feel merely unlikely. Now we're ready for the CIA officer's core claim. Not that Montauk was a literal time portal, but that Montauk, as a story, emerged from the overlap of three real forces. 1. Cold War electronic warfare and signals work. 2. Fringe intelligence collection programs, remote viewing, psychological research, influence operations. 3. A cultural ecosystem hungry for a single explanation big enough to hold America's paranoia. You want a timeline? He asked me. Then he gave me one, not dates, but phases. Phase 1. WWII. Experimentation, signal manipulation, degaussing myths, Philadelphia. Phase 2. Cold War infrastructure, radar, surveillance, obsession with prediction, Montauk's physical stage. Phase 3. Post-Watergate distrust, exposure of intelligence abuses, Montauk's cultural ignition. Phase 4. Storytellers connecting dots, selling frameworks, creating a single monster that can hold all fears at once. And Phase 5? I asked. He stared at the flickering fluorescent light above us. Then he said, Phase 5 is when agencies learn to use the myth. That sentence is the turning point. Because it changes the story from a question about whether time travel exists to a question about whether time travel myths can be weaponized. Let that sink in. If you can't control time, you can still control people with a story about time. You can distract, you can discredit, you can launder a real program through absurdity. You can make anyone who gets close to the truth look like they're chasing portals. He didn't say the CIA did this. He said it like a strategy that could be used by anyone who understands human psychology. Because once you understand how myths function, you can steer them. At this point in the conversation, I asked him what I should have asked earlier. Why are you telling me? He hesitated. That hesitation wasn't fear. It was calculation. Because, he said, Montauk isn't just a story about time. It's a story about consent. And I'm tired of hearing people treat it like entertainment. Consent, that's where the script stops being fun. So we went there. Not literally into the base, into the ethical trench. He told me about how human subject research can become predatory when it's wrapped in secrecy. You tell a subject it's training. You tell a subject it's for national security. You tell a subject their discomfort is part of the process. And when they protest, you treat protest as failure. You label them unstable. You isolate them. You make the institution's need bigger than the person's pain. When people say they experimented on kids, he said, I don't want to argue specifics. I want people to understand why it's plausible that vulnerable people get used. Because it happens in small ways long before it ever becomes a monster story. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said the CIA's most enduring time travel project wasn't time travel. It was timeline management. I asked what that meant. He said, "A timeline is a narrative. A narrative tells people what happened, why it happened, and what it means. If you can influence narrative, you influence future behavior." That's the closest most institutions will ever get to controlling time. Timeline management. It sounds clinical, but it's terrifying, because it means the story is the weapon, not the machine. Now, you might be wondering where the Philadelphia and Montauk connection becomes more than symbolic. Where does a WWII ship rumor actually connect to a Long Island Cold War base beyond internet stitching? Here's where the legend provides its own bridge. Some Montauk narratives claim that individuals involved in Philadelphia later became involved in Montauk. Names like Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron appear in those stories. They claim they experienced time jumps. They claim they were part of secret programs. They claim memory suppression. They claim recovered recollections. This is the part of the story where skepticism has to be steel. Because memory is not a hard drive. It's a storyteller. It is vulnerable to suggestion, vulnerable to trauma, vulnerable to repetition, vulnerable to the very myth ecosystem we've been describing. But here's what makes these claims relevant, even if you don't believe them literally. They illustrate how a mythology recruits people. It offers a role, a narrative identity. A way to explain suffering, a way to turn confusion into meaning, a way to turn ordinary pain into extraordinary purpose. And when someone has lived through experiences that feel like lost time, trauma, dissociation, institutional gaslighting, the language of time travel becomes a kind of emotional truth. Not a physics truth, an identity truth. That doesn't make it false, it makes it complicated. And complication is where real human stories live. The CIA officer understood that. He wasn't mocking the people who believed they were victims. He was angry at the machine that could create victims. Then came the part I almost didn't include. Because it's the most cinematic, and cinematic details are exactly what you have to distrust. He told me there was a moment, years ago, when someone brought him a file. Not a file stamped time travel, a mundane folder, an internal memo, a complaint, a small thing. He said the complaint wasn't about portals, it was about temporal disorientation. The phrase was clinical, boring, and that's why it scared him. The complaint described people involved in a program reporting sequence collapse, time feeling non-linear, events seeming out of order, memory fragments that didn't attach to dates, a sense that the world had lost its usual rhythm. You don't need a time machine to cause that. You can cause it with stress, with sleep deprivation, with sensory manipulation, with isolation, with drugs, with electromagnetic exposure, with trauma, with suggestion. But if you are running a program built around prediction, around influencing perception, then temporal disorientation is not a side effect. It's a warning. It means you are breaking the operator. And what did you do? I asked. He shrugged. A small, tired movement. I did what institutions do, he said. I pushed it up the chain, and I watched the chain absorb it. Absorb it. Meaning, nothing happened. Or something happened that he never saw. Or the problem was renamed. Or the program moved. Or the people got discarded. Or the paper got buried. That is the fifth reveal. The real horror of these legends isn't that time travel exists. It's that programs can harm people and then erase the harm behind classification. And in that erasure, victims become ghosts, which means the public fills the gap with literal ghosts. portals, monsters, time loops, because at least those explanations feel like an explanation. Now we can finally understand his opening line. Philadelphia was the prototype. Montauk was the correction, not as physics, as bureaucracy. Philadelphia, a rumor gets loose, a story that mingles with real wartime work, a story that grows teeth. Montauk. A later era learns how to handle such stories, how to compartment, how to seed, how to let absurdity run interference for sensitive work, how to keep the public chasing the impossible while the possible stays protected. That's the correction. Not correcting time, correcting narrative leakage. Once you see that, everything changes. Because now the question isn't, is the Montauk Project real? The question is, how many real programs have been protected by their proximity to myths? And then, the most uncomfortable question of all, if an agency can benefit from myth, does it ever have an incentive to end myth? The CIA officer answered that with silence, a long one, the kind that feels like a door closing. He finally said, "People want a clean ending. They want a confession. They want a villain. But this isn't a movie. It's a system. And systems don't confess. They evolve. So where does that leave us? We could stop here, satisfied with a neat, cynical conclusion. Time travel is a myth. Montauk is a story. Philadelphia is an overgrown rumor. The end? But that wouldn't be honest. Because the reason you're still listening isn't because you want cynicism. It's because you felt something in the premise. That itch. That sense that reality has seams. That the government has rooms you can't enter. That something about time feels too fragile to be as stable as we pretend. So, I'll give you the honest ending. Not clean, but true to the shape of the evidence. Here's what we can say without building castles. 1. WWII created real electromagnetic and signal projects that the public didn't understand, and those projects became fertile soil for legends like Philadelphia. 2. The Cold War produced real intelligence programs that explored the mind and perception, including unethical efforts, and that precedent makes later claims feel less dismissible. 3. Montauk is a real place with real Cold War infrastructure, and the physical atmosphere of that place helps myths attach and persist. 4. The most extreme claims, portals, monsters, literal time travel, remain unproven and heavily dependent on testimony that is hard to verify. 5. Myths can function as camouflage, intentionally or unintentionally, by making serious inquiry socially radioactive. Now I'll tell you what I believe happened. Not as a final answer, as a working model. I believe Philadelphia began as a misunderstanding layered onto real wartime work. Maybe degaussing, maybe radar interference, maybe a test that made sailors sick, maybe a rumor that grew. I believe it escalated over years because the public needed a symbol for government secrecy. I believe Montauk, the legend, grew out of real Cold War paranoia and real infrastructure, amplified by a cultural moment when people were ready to believe the worst. I believe people were harmed in secret programs that had nothing to do with portals and everything to do with control. I believe that harm produced fractures, lost time, broken sequences that victims described with the largest language available. Time travel. And I believe institutions learned something from the way these myths behaved. Not how to build a time machine, how to manage a timeline. That is the story beneath the story. When I left Montauk Point that day, I drove past the lighthouse and watched the ocean flash between trees. And I kept thinking about time as a physical thing, not a concept, a current, a force, something that can be diverted. Not by machines, by narratives. Because here is the most subtle form of time travel. You make people believe the past happened a certain way. Then you get to live in the future that belief creates. That's not science fiction. That's history. I saw the CIA officer one last time, not in the garage, in a place with sunlight, which felt intentional. A coffee shop near a park, where the air smelled like wet leaves. Normal life. The kind of place you meet someone when you want to pretend nothing you say matters. He asked me if I'd gone to Montauk. I told him yes. I told him it felt like a stage set for secrets. He nodded. Then he said, "Stages matter." He took a sip of coffee. He looked older in daylight, more human. "Do you believe it?" I asked him. Not, "Do you believe in time travel? Do you believe the story has teeth?" He didn't answer directly. He answered like a man who had learned to survive ambiguity. "I believe," he said, "that people have done things in the name of national security that they couldn't live with in daylight. And I believe that when those things leak into the public, they leak as monsters. Because monsters are easier to talk about than bureaucracy. And monsters are easier to fear than paperwork." He slid something across the table. Not a classified folder, a single sheet of paper, a photocopy. Most of it blacked out. Not with thick, dramatic censor bars, with the kind of sterile redaction that makes a document feel like a corpse. At the top was a bland title, a committee meeting. A discussion of public narratives and risk, a line about containment. He didn't let me keep it. He let me read it, then he took it back, as if the act of seeing was the point. "What is that?" I asked. He looked at the paper as if it disgusted him. "That," he said, "is the correction." And then he did something that surprised me. He apologized, not for what he said, for the fact that this is how the world works. "I wish it was portals," he said quietly. "I really do. Because portals would be clean. Portals would be science. Portals would be solvable. But this," he tapped the table, "this is just people. And people are the hardest thing to classify." That line is where the story lands, not in a secret tunnel, not in a vortex, not with a ship disappearing. It lands in the hardest truth of all. A government doesn't need to bend time to change your reality. It only needs to control what you think happened. It only needs to decide what becomes official memory. It only needs to erase the files, or bury them, or surround them with monsters until no one wants to touch them. Philadelphia, Montauk. Prototype, correction. If there was ever a time machine in this story, it wasn't made of metal. It was made of narrative. A machine that rewrites the past just enough to steer the future. And if you listen closely, you can hear it working. Not in the ocean wind at Montauk. Not in the hum of a radar tower. Not in the static of old war stories. You can hear it in the way people argue, the way they dismiss, the way they laugh, the way they call someone crazy and move on. That's the correction. It doesn't erase the past. It erases the courage to look at it. So here's the promise I made at the beginning. You were going to get time. And you weren't going to like how it behaves. Time, in this story, behaves like a weapon. A thing people try to control through secrecy. A thing people try to escape through myth. A thing people break inside other people, and then call it research. And the final image I can't shake is not a ship vanishing. It's a lighthouse, standing at the end of Long Island, throwing light over a dark sea. A lighthouse exists to keep you from crashing. But it can't show you what's under the water. It can only show you where the surface ends. And that's what these stories are. Philadelphia, Montauk, a CIA officer's warning. They're lighthouses, not proof of portals, proof of boundaries. Boundaries between what we know and what we're allowed to know. Boundaries between what happened and what was recorded. Boundaries between a person's mind and a system's hunger. If you want to call it time travel, you can. But understand what you're really saying. You're saying someone got to decide the timeline. And once you see that, you realize the most dangerous projects don't need machines. They only need silence.